What's up, coders? Hope you are doing well. Today we are creating a CSS Box Shadow Editor with HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Styling box shadows using just code can get quite tedious and inefficient, so this Box Shadow Editor allows us to quickly tweak the various box shadow property values and watch the live preview until we reach the desired effect. At the same time, the corresponding CSS code for the box shadow is generated, and using the copy button we can easily copy the generated CSS to Clipboard in order to paste it into our project. Finally, we can also change the box and background colors in case, for example, we want to match the colors of our specific project. I hope you guys will enjoy this video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and without further ado, let's go! This is our starting point. In the project folder, I've created 3 files, the index.html, style.css, and main.js files. In the index.html file, I typed some basic HTML5 boilerplate code, inserted the title, and linked the external files to the document, the style.css and main.js files. Both of them are currently empty. Notice that instead of placing the script in the body right above the closing body tag, I placed it in the head using the defer attribute, so that the script will be executed after the document has been parsed but before the DOM content loaded event is fired. And now let's proceed to defining the markup for the body. For starters, let's add an h1 heading, Box Shadow Editor, and next let's create a div with the class Box Container. And by the way, I can do this due to the Emmet plugin, which is embedded into the Visual Studio Code editor, which is the editor I'm currently using. Box Container will contain the box and the color inputs container for box and background. So let's add these elements. Box will not have any content, we will style it later with CSS, and regarding the color inputs, let's group each input with its label within a div with the class input block. The first input block concerns the box background color, so let's set the label for box background, text will be box, input will be of type color, name will be box background, and ID as well, since it should match the value of the for attribute of label. And let's also set the initial value to this bluish color. The second input block is about setting the box container background color. I will just paste this in order to save some time. Notice that in this case, the initial value is set to white. And that's all with the box container. Next step is to add this part containing the generated CSS for box shadow and the button to copy the generated CSS to Clipboard. So let's do this. Let's initially set the text for generated CSS to box shadow with 10 pixels horizontal offset, 10 pixels vertical offset, 5 pixels blur radius, and 0 spread. And let's set the color to black with opacity set to 0.25. The text for the copy button will be set to copy. Okay, and finally, let's add the markup for the settings, where we can change the various box shadow property values. Similarly to box container color inputs, each input with its label will be contained within an input block. So let me paste and quickly go through. The first input is horizontal offset, which is of course of type number, and initial value is set to 10, keeping it consistent with the corresponding box shadow property value at generated CSS. Next input is vertical offset with initial value 10. Next, blur radius with initial value 5. Notice that in this case we also set a minimum value to 0 since blur cannot get less than that, it can't take negative values. Next we have spread with initial value 0. Next comes the box shadow color input, which is of course of type color and initial value is set to black, followed by the input for opacity, which is of type number and initial value is set to 0.25. Also notice that in this case we set minimum and maximum value to 0 and 1 and the step to 0.01. And lastly we have the inset input, which is of type checkbox, so that we can check or uncheck depending whether we want an inner or an outer shadow. And I think we are done with HTML, but before proceeding to CSS, let's open the project in the browser. For this purpose, I'm using the Live Server, which is a Visual Studio Code extension and allows for live reloading so that we don't have to refresh each time we want to see the changes we've made. So this is what we've created up to this point, and let's proceed to styling with CSS. For starters, I will paste some general styling, and by the way, as usual, I will include a link to this project in the description. So we are importing the Montserrat font family from Google Fonts, setting margin and padding to 0 and box sizing to border box for all elements, and for the body we set font family, background color and color. And if we save, this is the result we get. Next, for the H1 heading, let's set text align to center, font size to 2.5 rem, and let's also add some margin to the top and bottom, 2 rem and 0 left and right. And let's proceed to styling the box container. Let's set background color to white, minimum height to 50% of viewport height, width to 90% of its container element's width, in this case the body, and in order to horizontally center it, let's set margin to 0 for top and bottom and auto for left and right. Let's also add a border, 1 pixel solid, and let's give it a light gray color. Position will be set to relative since the color inputs container will be absolutely positioned relative to box container. And finally, we will use flexbox in order to horizontally and vertically center its content, in this case the box. Next, let's proceed to styling the colors container. And let's start by positioning it close to the top right corner by setting its position to absolute and top and right to 1 rem. Nice. And let's also set background color, border and padding. Okay, and let's increase the distance between label and input a bit by setting margin right for the label to 3 pixels. And let's also add some space between the two input blocks by setting margin bottom for the first input block. Notice the use of the first child selector here to 1 rem. Nice. And now let's proceed to styling the box. Let's set width and height to 300 pixels. Background color to the same bluish background color we are initially using for the box color input. Let's also add some margin in order to ensure that we have space for the box shadow, and let's set it to 160 pixels. And finally, let's also set box shadow using the same box shadow specified in the generated CSS section in order to be consistent. Very nice. Now, in order to accelerate, I will not type the remaining CSS code, I will just paste and quickly go through. So next, we are styling the generated CSS container, which contains the generated CSS and the copy button. Some trivial styling here. Maybe the only thing I would like to note is that again we are using Flexbox for the layout, but this time we are setting the justify content property to space between so that we push the two children, the flex items, towards the edges of the container, left and right. And if we save, okay, eventually we will add responsiveness, but for now let's set width to 90% so that we don't have to maximize the window yet. Much better. Now for generated CSS, we just set the font family to some font which is more typically used for code, some basic styling for the copy button, and if copying to clipboard was successful, the success class will be added to the button, changing its background color to green or almost green. Otherwise, the error class will be added, changing the background color to red. Next, we have the styling for the settings section, and if we save, this is the result. The div with the class settings is the container element, and again we are using Flexbox for the layout, but this time we are also setting the flex wrap property to wrap. Default value is no wrap, so that flex items can break into multiple lines if necessary. For input blocks, and recall an input block contains the label and the input, we set padding, font size, font weight, white space to no wrap so that text won't wrap to the next line. For example, if I zoom in here and remove this styling, you can see what's happening. We set flex to 1 so that they extend to all available width, each taking the same space. Again, for the layout of each input block, we are using Flexbox, this time setting flex direction to column instead of the default, which is row. And for labels, we set margin bottom and some basic styling for inputs. Note that for input elements, font family is not by default inherited, so we should specify it. And finally, for input elements with type attribute set to number, we add some padding to the left. Okay, we are actually done. Now let's set width of generated CSS container back to 50%. and add some basic responsiveness for smaller screens. We won't expand any further on this one. As already mentioned, you can find a link to the final project in the description in case you want to have a closer look. Okay, let's save and check the result. Okay, and probably the most significant difference between larger and smaller screens is the positioning of the copy button. In the case of smaller screens, it is absolutely positioned relative to the generated CSS container to the top right corner in order to make some more space for the generated CSS. I think I'm quite satisfied with the way our editor looks, and now it's time to bring it to life with JavaScript. For starters, let's store the various elements we'll need to access into variables. First, the box element. And similarly, we get the remaining elements, the box container, the box background, and box container background. These two are color input elements. The generated CSS element containing the generated CSS. We are not accessing the copy button yet. We will discuss about that later. And we are selecting all settings input elements so that we can easily loop through and add an event listener. But we are also accessing each settings input individually in order to make it easier to form the box shadow text by joining the various box shadow property values. And now let's add functionality. For starters, when the box background color input changes value, we want the box background to change accordingly. For this purpose, we will add an event listener over the box background color input for the input event, which fires whenever the value of the input element has been changed. And in this case, we want to set the box background color to the current input value. Okay, let's check if it works. Nice, and let's do the same for the container background color. And let's check the result. Okay. Next, we want to update the box shadow as well as the generated CSS code whenever any of the settings inputs value changes. For this purpose, for each element in the settings node list of input elements, and let's call each input setting, we will add an event listener, again for the input event, and whenever such an event occurs, the update box shadow function will be executed. We will implement this function right now. And the first thing we want to do here is to form the updated value of box shadow property by joining the individual property values. We will do this using template literals. First, we get the horizontal offset value from the corresponding input. And similarly, we get the vertical offset, blur radius, and spread radius. Now, in order to get the RGBA color value, we have to work a bit more. And that's mainly due to the fact that the color value we get from input is in hexadecimal form. For example, let's log out the box background color upon an input event. And if I change the box background color to red, this is the input color value we get. So we should first convert the hexadecimal color value to its corresponding RGB value. For this purpose, we will use this hex to RGB function, which takes a hex color string as an argument and returns an array containing the RGB values. Alternatively, we could return the RGB string. However, for our specific use case, this would be more convenient. And here is an example of using the hex to RGB function, passing the red color in hex form as an argument, and this is the result we would get. Notice that this function would also return the same result if we only used 3 characters for the red color instead of 6, plus the hash symbol, of course. Okay, I think now we have everything we need in order to form the RGBA value of box shadow. Let me zoom out a bit. Color.value is the box shadow color input value in hexadecimal form, and using the hex to RGB function, we get the array with RGB values. Now, in order to concatenate the array elements into a string, we will use the join method with comma and white space as separator. So by now we have the RGB values, and what remains is to add the alpha value, the opacity. Okay, and finally, when the inset checkbox is checked, we want to add the inset property value into the box shadow, and when it is unchecked, we want to remove it. For this purpose, we can use the ternary operator. I will paste and go through. Here we are. Without adding white space after the RGBA value, we check whether the inset checkbox is checked, and if this is true, then we add white space followed by the word inset, otherwise the empty string. And once we have the box shadow value, all we have to do is to set the box shadow for the box to that value. And similarly, we can set the text content of generated CSS. And that should be it. Let's check the result. By increasing horizontal offset, indeed box shadow moves further to the right and generated CSS is updated accordingly. By decreasing vertical offset, box shadow moves further to the top. And let's also change blur and spread and box shadow color to red. And let's increase opacity. And finally, we can set box shadow to inset or not. Excellent. What remains now is to implement the copy to clipboard functionality. So let's do this. And by the way, I'm not using the event parameter anywhere here, so I could as well just remove it. Okay, let's proceed. First, we want to select the copy button and store it into a variable for easier access. And next, we add an event listener for the click event over the generated CSS copy button, and when the copy button is clicked, the generated CSS copy button click function will be executed. In case you had any doubt on the purpose of this function, and let's implement the function right now. In here goes the copy to clipboard code. For this purpose, we will use the Clipboard API, which is designed to replace the document.exec command in accessing the clipboard. It is available on the navigator.clipboard object, and more specifically, we will use the write text property, which writes the specified text string to the system clipboard. Notice that it returns a promise, and therefore this way of copying to clipboard is asynchronous, and here is an example which sets the clipboard's contents to the string empty clipboard. So let's copy this example and paste it into our project. And now, by clicking the copy button, we expect this text to be copied to clipboard. Let's check. So if I click on the copy button and paste here, indeed it works. But instead, we would like to copy the generated CSS text. So let's do this. And let's check if this works. Let's also change some values: horizontal offset and vertical offset, and color, and opacity, and copy and paste. Excellent. So the main functionality is there. What remains now is to improve the user experience, so that user can tell that something happened after clicking the copy button. For this purpose, if copying to clipboard was successful, we will set the button text to copied, and also add the success class over the button. We will keep this for 1 second using the set timeout function, and after that we will remove the success class and set the text back to copy. And similarly, in case of failure, we set the text to error and add and remove the error class. Okay, this should work. However, since this action is happening asynchronously, I think it would make sense to temporarily disable the button as soon as it is clicked and re-enable it once the action is completed, plus the 1 second timeout, whether of course action was successful or not. Let's check the result. If I click on the copy button, seems to be working as intended. Let's also change some values, inset and color to white, and let's increase opacity and blur and spread and copy and paste. Works like a charm. Now, regarding browser support for Clipboard API, and more specifically for the write text property, we can see that it is quite good, but not perfect. It is not yet supported by Safari, and of course Internet Explorer. At first it also wasn't working for my Edge browser, however after updating it was working fine, and to be honest I'm quite satisfied with what Microsoft guys did with the new version of Edge. Anyway, back to browser support for Clipboard API. I've also checked at caniuse.com, and as of March 24, 2020, browser support for the write text property covers around 71% of global usage. And since this feature is just supplementary, it is not essential to our application, I'm quite comfortable with this browser support. Worst case scenario, user can always manually select and copy. However, if it is not supported, there is no reason for the copy button to be here. For this purpose, let's move back to our HTML file, and instead of adding the copy button here, we will do it with JavaScript only if the Clipboard API is available. Now, we could do this in our JavaScript file, which is executed anyway before the DOM content loaded event fires. However, I would prefer to create the button as soon as possible. I suppose we could even do it at this point, but I think we would be just fine by placing the script at the end of the body, right above the closing body tag. And if the Clipboard API is available, or in other words, if the navigator.clipboard object exists, we want to create the copy button and add it to the DOM. Let me paste and quickly go through. So at first we select the generated CSS container and store it into a variable for easier access. This is where we will append the newly created element, the copy button, as its last child. We then create the button element and set its ID and text content. And finally, we append the copy button to its container element using the append child method. What remains now is to move back to our JavaScript file and again ensure that the copy to clipboard related code will only be executed if the Clipboard API is available. And I think we are done. Let's make sure that everything still works fine. Here is a copy button. If I open the project with Internet Explorer, we can see that the copy button is missing, and that's because the Clipboard API is not supported. Although in this case we probably have a lot more things to worry about, not just the copy button. Now back to Chrome, let's make a few changes. And copy and paste. Very nice. Now watch the copy button. I will refresh the page again and again and again. You can see that the copy button is instantly created and added to the page. It doesn't even blink. Okay guys, let's leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed this video and got some value out of it, and maybe even got inspired to go ahead and create your own editors. There are all sorts of editors you could create. If you like this video, please hit the like button. YouTube algorithm and I would appreciate it a lot. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, keep coding, keep improving, and enjoy the journey. Take care. Bye.